I can imagine. So I remember the first time I saw your chart is it was shared in Dispatch Slack.
Hmm.
No, wait, it was even before then. So it was
Wow.
before then. And so I remember seeing the chart and it created an enormous amount of conversation internally about where each person was, or and each entity was marked, and a lot of agreement, actually not that much disagreement, but intense interest amongst my fellow journalists as to where different outlets were. And so one of the questions I had is, do you get lobbied? In other words, do outlets come to you and say, we really don't like where you put our podcast, or we really don't like where you put our website in this chart? And if so, how do you account for that? Or are they kind of leaving you alone?
Oh, we definitely hear from folks, and it really depends on exactly where they are on the chart, as you can imagine. So, even from the very beginning, as you can imagine, folks that are really far out to the left and right and very low, they sort of know what they're doing, right? They're
Right.
not interested in improving their rating with Ad Fontes Media. They're like, "Who are you?" And then they can just sort of use it as fodder to make their own chart.
Yeah.
Infowars actually did that with the first one. It was pretty hilarious.
Oh gosh. Infowars is the Alex Jones outlet for those who don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, with the extreme voices, that's one thing. But then you've got folks, folks that are rated high, especially how you found us, right? Folks are very interested, like, oh, great, this is what we've been trying to do, thanks. And can we use this for in our ad sales, or could you audit us? If we've had publications look for audits because they get complaints of bias and they're trying to hit the middle of the road and they just want a sanity check. As you can imagine, if you all probably know this, when you're trying to be fair and in the middle, minimally biased as possible, you still get attacks from left and right. You still get
Oh,
lots of
sure. Yeah.
criticism from it. Sometimes pretty harsh, right? So we provide those sanity checks for outlets that reach out like that, and but we do, for folks that are sort of in the middle, like, hey, we thought our podcast wouldn't be quite this far left, or maybe it should be higher than this other one on the other side. It's about the same. Often it's just an inquiry, like they're interested in knowing exactly why. And so we have our analysts take notes on each piece of content, especially if it's rated really low. So we have citations for it.
So, and as I'm thinking through this, so you market to advertisers. There is a question I always get from people just in my life, and that is, okay, David, I read you. They'll say that because I'm standing in front of them, or I listen to you. Maybe they do, or maybe they don't. But who else? Like, who else is reliable? Who else is just going to kind of give it to me straight? And my answer has typically been to sort of focus on people, not outlets. Like, okay, here's a reporter that I found really reliable. Here's a podcaster that I think is really, really interesting. But it strikes me that pointing people to this chart, that there's sort of a consumer facing use for this chart. In other words, to sort of say, okay, here we've had people left, right, and center rate these various news outlets. And have you pushed it out in any way in sort of that consumer facing way as opposed to advertisers?
Yeah, definitely. That's really how it got started. I mean,
Mhm.
I created this chart not thinking that, yeah, I created it to share it with my friends to talk about politics. I mean, I didn't really think that there would be some sort of advertiser data, ad tech thing, which I know a lot more about that than I ever thought I would. But it started with consumers and educators. This was, people would share this with their friends because it was sort of this rare thing, especially in the 2016, 2017, where the level of vitriol around that particular election on social media and how Facebook shared news back then, you had really caused a lot of divisions among family members and friends. Like, people just unfriended folks so quickly. And this was a way where, even if people disagreed about the relative placements of news outlets, they'd say, "Oh, CNN or Fox needs to be higher, lower, left, or more left or righter." They still had this common framework that they could use to talk to their political opposites. If they're as long as they're not too far gone, right? And folks would say, okay, well, I'll tell one on myself. I know the sources I read and listen to are maybe a bit more biased than than I should be listening to. So let me try to move up the chart a bit. And so it really got this popular traction among consumers. And today, our website, most people that visit it are consumers and educators. We have this interactive version where you can just search any of like about 3,000 news sources, news and information sources that we've got on there. And so when people get forwarded some crazy Rumble video, you know, they can they're not quite sure about. They can go look it up, and it's that's a service. We do have some like consumer education. We do have a big part of our business also is media literacy education in schools because we saw this as getting used by teachers to combat the like accusations of bias by teachers themselves, right? Like here's a reference, a third party reference. Also, don't take their word for it. You analyze the news sources on your own. Learn to analyze and see how reliable and biased something is yourself.
So I'm curious, when you have your team, and I think it's fascinating, you have this left, right, and center sort of analysis. How fractious is the analysis sometimes? Or does the team actually come to a degree of consensus relatively easily? But it strikes me that you've kind of pulled off something unique if you've got like a left, right, and center analysis, and it does regularly reach consensus. But
Yes.
how difficult is that process?
It works a lot more often than it doesn't. And it's
Mhm.
really surprising given the volume of content that we rate. I mean, this sounds crazy, but only about less than 1% of the content that we rate every week has to go to a second pod. That's how we elevate it, right? And it's a function of a couple of things. One, like yes, the this is a unique space where you have left, right, center folks coming together literally all day, every day in shifts in Zoom, talking to each other about news and politics today and about the most contentious issues about race and abortion and guns and Trump, right? Every day and getting along and being respectful of each other. And it's the sort of thing that would give you hope for America, just to hang out with our analysts. But it's a function of the fact that they're not trying to convince each other of the ultimate rightness or wrongness of the underlying position, right? They're talking about it through a layer of abstraction, which is the piece of content. It's the article. How biased is this article, right? This article is talking about abortion, how left or right is the position being advocated in this particular article? How reliable, how dense with facts is this particular article? And those are the criteria that they're looking at. I mean, they're looking at it for purposes of analysis. And that's hard when they first start and when we're first training analysts, especially when it comes to TV and podcast content. So imagine, you're on the left or you're on the right, and then you have to sit through an hour of like the most offensive opposite side content and just sit there with it, right? It makes people feel nauseous, it, and but it's when they look at it from the point of view of like breaking down the component pieces and trying to score it, right? Like try to put it in a part of the chart. The definitions of each category are really specific, right? So a left and a right and a center person can look at a CNN opinion article that is left leaning, and they will all say this is left leaning opinion, and they're just hardly any points apart at all, right? So we do have some where the political issues, they evoke emotion, and uh, folks want to talk about the underlying arguments there, but it's remarkably rare for how often we're
Hmm.
doing this.
Fascinating. That is fascinating. Yeah, when you were talking, I was sort of reminded of my wife a couple of years ago thought about writing a novel based on the experience of Facebook moderators because she had read some really long and actually talked to some Facebook moderators who, this is a little different from your situation, but they're exposed to hour after hour of content that they would never seek out themselves, and sometimes is really horrible. Um, and they, there's predictable mental health issues that result from that. So I know it's not the same thing as being a moderator in the sense that you're seeing stuff that should be literally pulled from the internet. But does it have an impact on your folks to sit there and just marinate in this stuff and stew in this stuff all day?
Yes, it certainly does. And fortunately, we don't have it as bad as the social media moderators. I mean, I think the mental health issues that really stem from seeing some of the really like violent content. And that's, I really don't know what the solution is for that. That is such a hard thing to have to do. But with politics, uh, and even seeing like very extreme left and right, it's at first it has that effect, right? But long term, we don't we see it wear off, like because it's like an inoculation. It's a fascinating thing. If you've ever seen somebody walk into a hotel lobby or airport or a relative's house, and Fox News or MSNBC is on, whichever one you don't like, they're like, "Ugh, just turn it off. I can't even." It's literally a coping mechanism to shut that stuff off because it challenges your worldview, it challenges your very identity and who you are. This is why it's like really hard to reach people who have their politics so closely tied with their identity. So even in the face of facts, nothing matters. And it, but for our analysts, like while they might have that initial reaction, what develops over time is this like understanding of like, oh, this is why other people think how they think. Like this is why the country is like it is. It was really eye opening for me, when I first, you know, the first chart that had the cable news shows on it. I had to sit and watch all of the cable news shows on all of the channels. Like I thought I knew what was on the other channels. I did not, right? And it was alarming to me that I would watch something and be like, oh, somebody out there, many people, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of people who watch this and think, yes, I agree. And that is that's so jarring. So I think it helps with Thanksgiving conversations, right? Like your relative says something that's totally alarming and shocking to you, but like if you've heard it before, it's not really alarming and shocking, and you understand why people think how they think.
So I have to circle back to this podcast,
Yes.
and I just got to ask, what is it that you like about this podcast, Vanessa?
It's the thing that we like about all reliable information. So you named those top categories. Like there are a number of characteristics of news and informational content that make it highly reliable, that live in that highly reliable space. Obviously, original fact reporting with the work that journalists do is at that very apex. But your fact dense analysis and even simple fact reporting is all really important. So, what you do in this podcast, if I may characterize it myself, is although it's called advisory opinions, it's not really full of opinions. It's really full, it's really dense with facts, right? So when you start out discussing a case, you lay out what the facts of the case are, like the posture of the case, and then even when you talk about the law at issue, you're stating what the law is, and that's a new fact that you're bringing to your listeners, right? And then you'll make some predictions about how the case you think is likely to turn out. But predictions falls under analysis, and there's definitely a gradient of a spectrum of like analysis to opinion. Folks often put it in a binary, like, oh, it's facts, news reporting versus opinion. But the gradient from analysis down to opinion really has to do with how closely tied to the facts the conclusion is, or the prediction is. And you all hem very closely to making predictions that are really closely tied to the facts. as a function of being attorneys, right? And so our when we are analyzing, what we do in terms of content analysis has a lot of principles rooted in like legal writing and legal analysis. So our analysts are looking for, well, how dense with facts is it? And advisory opinions is really dense with facts.
Yes. Yes, indeed. All right. Well, this has been fascinating. I have been a devotee of your chart for a long time, and I had not seen the podcast chart. And then
Mhm.
when I saw the podcast chart, like it just, of course, you immediately look for your logo,
Of
right?
course.
And there it was. And so I appreciate you. I appreciate you and your team taking time to evaluate what we do. And
Of course.
we'll be looking at our continued presence on the chart. No pressure. We're not going to lobby you. We want this to be a
Of
totally
course.
unbiased process,
Of course.
but really do appreciate what you do. And I wanted to let you know it makes a difference. People do note, I mean, you know this, but people are noting this and talking about this. And it's fun for us to kind of get a peek behind the curtain, see how the process works. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.